Imagine if you approached your career like you were running a one-person business. What would that look like, and what would the impact be? So that's how I've managed my career, and it's meant that in fact I've had 27 jobs in 45 years. Now that normally isn't a recipe for success, but in my case it's done me very well. I've earned consistently somewhere in the region of 5 times the average wage in the UK year over year, always been above 6 figures. And if that's interesting to you, stick around. I'll tell you the pluses and minuses, how it's worked for me, how I've approached it, and what the great benefits have been, and why I think it's something that you should consider too. All right, so what are we talking about here when I say that we approach your career like a business? Well, if you think about a business, any business, what a business does is it takes the assets at its disposal and it applies them in the most efficient and productive and profitable way that it can find. Now, when you look at that compared to a career, in a career you tend to just think of yourself and the place where you work. Now, frequently circumstances change. Your value in the market may actually go up, but because you're stuck in a fairly rigid construct of a job working for a firm, you don't tend to take advantage of the fact that you're worth more on the open market. So around the turn of the century, what changed for me was, having been in a series of fairly standard blue chip style employments, I set up my own business, and within 3 years I'd got used to the fact that businesses change and move, and the market changes and moves, and provided you're willing to move with it, keep your ear to the ground and keep looking for opportunities, there were plenty of things that you could do. And I was talking here about a very small business that had 3 employees, and nevertheless there were things I could do using those 3 employees which I could never do if I'd been working for a firm. So when I sold that business, I decided that that would be my guiding principle. I would make sure that I always got the best return for the value on the assets that I was investing, that's me, wherever it was. And I therefore moved whenever I felt that my market value was greater than I was being paid, or the enjoyment factor or the learning factor. In other words, the growth in the asset that I had, my own knowledge, was not being reflected by the benefits that I was getting out of the business. When I felt that was the case, I looked around and I would move. So that's meant subsequently that I have moved probably once a year, maybe once every 18 months on sometimes less than a year. And it's meant that sometimes I've been working as a consultant, sometimes as a contractor, other times I've actually been an employee. Nevertheless, I always approached every job in the same way, which is, am I getting the best return on the investment I'm making? So what are the pluses and minuses of approaching your career in this way? Well, first plus, let's face it, I never get bored. So if I get bored, I start thinking about whether I'm actually bored because the return on my investment is actually dropping below the point where I'm comfortable with it. Second point, and this is the major one really, you actually have control over your own life. When you're an employee of a firm, to some extent, you have to basically toe the line with the direction in which the firm is travelling. And it's only really at the very last stage that you might think about moving. What I do is set the bar much higher. If I think the firm is making a wrong decision about the direction of travel, I get out of it. Now, this puts a big onus on me to make the right decisions, but it does mean that I have agency, I have power over my own life and my career. Other pluses, you get the market rate for your skill set. If you're a really good accountant and you can market your skills in an up-and-coming firm, I would move. And in some respects, that means that as you change jobs, you normally get a rate increase. Your pay goes up, you get a bump of some description, because if you weren't being paid the market rate and then you are being paid the market rate, then there you go. The next one is quite counterintuitive. you are actually more secure if you take this approach, because if you stay for 10 years in one firm, you've been out of the job market for a while at that point. If you're suddenly made redundant, it can be a real culture shock, and it can take you a significant time to actually get back up and running, get into the market, understand the market. And that brings me, I'm going to go back to one of the really big benefits now to close. That is a huge benefit in that it's really enjoyable as a way of working. You're always being met with a fresh set of challenges. You're always on the move, and that can be really great if that suits your personality. So let's look at the minuses. The first one obviously is if you're doing work on a consultancy or contract basis, there is a risk inherent in that approach that the contract comes to an end and you have a gap where you're not earning any money. That is obviously a risk. It never goes away, but you can mitigate it. Second minus, there can be lots of benefits which accrue when you're in an employed position, which you don't get if you're a contractor or a consultant. You have to be aware of those and make sure that when you're looking at whether a role is paying you enough, that you're taking into account all of those things. But that's a sort of arithmetic exercise, isn't it? I mean, all you have to do is check the benefits, add on the cost of supplying the benefits to your contracting or consulting gig, and there you have it. You have a comparison. The biggest one of these that you have to be aware of is that you obviously very rarely will you qualify for any kind of pension, so you have to supply your own pension out of your earnings. Another minus, this is not the sort of profile to follow if you're not willing to be flexible. You have to be able to, as we say in the UK, duck and dive a bit. You have to be able to take jobs maybe in the short term that you wouldn't necessarily want in order to plug a gap. As I talked about with the gaps, you have to be willing to actually take something which is suboptimal occasionally. This has happened to me around COVID especially. I took some gigs which I didn't really fancy very much, but it was good. It kept me going, kept the money coming in, and got me past the whole COVID lockdown era and into really good contracts after that. Next minus, again, if you're a person that likes to take it easy, this isn't the sort of profile to follow if you want to coast through your career. If you just want to basically keep your head down, this doesn't work. You have to be willing to get out there, put your neck on the line occasionally, put yourself forward, sometimes jump out of your comfort zone. So the other minus I wanted to mention as well, and this has kind of faded away a lot in the last 10 or 15 years, is sometimes if you present your CV for an employee role and your CV shows that you've had this amount of chopping and changing, it can make getting a job where they think you're going to be out of the door in a year quite hard. But these days that's very much dropped away, and for example 25-year-olds are used to moving at least every couple of years, and I think there's a trick being missed by the 45 and 50-year-olds who are used to the old model. They need to be looking at the new model now as well. Things like loyalty are now dead. Forget it. Loyalty's gone. You're all now about your own career and maximising the return on your investment. Okay, finally, let's look at how do you do it? How do you move from what you're doing currently into this type of profile? Well, the first thing to do is size up one thing, and that's what sort of skills do you have? And coming off the back of that, is your skill set transferable? So, for example, if you're an accountant and you're used to working in business or used to working in firms, that's a transferable skill. The basic rules of accountancy don't change. If you're a program or project manager, project management never changes. Yes, you might be doing different projects, but the frameworks and the skill set required to implement those frameworks doesn't really change, and it doesn't change between doing a project for £1 million and doing a project for £100 million. A really good skill set to have is sales. If you can sell, then this is definitely an approach I would take. And I have noticed that salespeople do tend to move around a lot. When I was an employee, I used to think that was some kind of reflection on their personality. I don't necessarily think it is that really now. I just think it's that they're aware of opportunities and they can see them coming and they think, why don't I move? The second element of how to do this thing is you have to get really good at interviews and you have to get really good at marketing yourself. If you're doing hundreds of interviews throughout your career, which I've done, you pretty quickly get adept at putting yourself forward really well, sizing up a room, watching the people who are doing the interview and understanding what are likely to be the hot buttons, being able to understand the mood in the room and what the actual unwritten elements of the job are. All of these things come almost to second nature when you've done it for 10 years. And the key thing, the key skill is that you have to learn how to think strategically and think about this in a way that isn't bound up with an employee approach. This is about working on how to maximize your key asset and how do you do that. Anyway, I hope that was useful. It would be really good if you could like this, comment on it especially, because I know this isn't necessarily how everybody sees the world and I'd be interested in your view. Please put a comment down here. Even if you violently disagree with me, that would be great. And also if you could follow me, because there's much more of this stuff coming down the track. And thanks very much.